Austin, do you want to lead us off?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start us off. So thank you everyone for being here. My name is Austin Turnbow. I'm a fourth year medical student. I am the liaison who's going to be giving you kind of the introduction to our organization, TIME, Trafficking in Medical Education. We're really excited to be partnering with Arizona's Emergency Medicine Medical Student Council. Thank you all very much for partnering with us for this event. We've been really looking forward to it for a while now. Just a little bit about TIME. It was an organization that was student founded, is student led, all by medical students at Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine. It was an organization that came about because we saw a need that needed to be filled. Human trafficking is an issue that is a little bit taboo, and not many people really know the true meaning of it, the widespread nature of the topic. And so as medical students, we decided to create this organization with the overall mission to address this problem from a healthcare standpoint. So human trafficking is one of the fastest growing multi-billion-dollar industries right now. According to most recent statistics, there's about 800,000 people approximately that are being trafficked every year. And a lot of these victims of human trafficking and survivors of human trafficking are usually seen at some point throughout their time during this at a healthcare facility, and they come into contact with many healthcare providers for various things. And we think that medical education right now is lacking on its training for those healthcare practitioners who are going out there and seeing these patients to be able to recognize and respond to those patients and their needs to get them the resources and help that they need. And so that's kind of our overarching goal. We're going about that from a ground up approach with training such as today, where we bring in an awesome speaker to tell us a little bit more about the issue and to inspire medical students and healthcare professionals to join the organization and make a difference at their own institution. We also go from a top-down approach where we've been speaking with NBME, NBOME, school officials and leadership, and trying to get board questions that are going to be instituted into our curriculum and to get more educational resources throughout our time in medical school and healthcare professional school in general. So that's a little bit about TIME. I'm a board of directors member. I'm the current treasurer. I also serve as the trainings coordinator. So hosting meetings like this, we've done many in Texas at multiple medical schools, and we're really excited to venture out and speak to some Arizona people as well. Get the word out, try to inspire y'all to join and create something similar at your own institution. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for the day. And I'm actually going to share my screen real quick so that you guys can have a visual here. So here's some basic info kind of about TIME, who to reach out to get involved in events like this. I'll go ahead and post the link to our website in the chat if you guys wanted to browse that. Now we'll get on to the main star of the day, Dr. TJ Webb. Dr. Webb is a family medicine physician currently residing up in the Midwest, but he spent some significant time in Waco, practicing in Waco. He's got a passion for creating advocates for victims of human trafficking. He really believes that this is a need that can be filled by medical students, by healthcare professionals in all their settings, and they can make a really big difference in the lives of many. He's got an extensive background in these trainings. He's been doing them for a long time. Through all his hard work with battling COVID and doing his clinic duties, Dr. Webb's always made time for these trainings. And we're really lucky to have him tonight. He's a mentor, he's a leader, he's an all-around awesome guy, and you're gonna really have a great time, and you're gonna learn a lot from his lecture. So without further ado, I don't know if Aubrey wanted to maybe introduce the Arizona Medical Student Council.
Hi, y'all. Yeah, just briefly, my name is Aubrey. I'm both secretary and extension committee chair for time, as well as the Arizona College of Osteopathic Medicine representative for the AZ MSC. So I'm kind of the middleman for us here today. You'll be hearing more from me post this call regarding both our MSc leadership opportunities, in addition to some leadership opportunities available in time, but I can give you guys more on that after Dr. Webb's talk. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you both so much. And thank you to Time and the Arizona Emergency Medicine Student Council for inviting me to come and give this talk today. It's something I'm really passionate about. Let me see if I can share my screen real quick here. Are you guys able to see my PowerPoint presentation at this point? Wonderful, very good. So the talk today is identifying and responding to victims of human trafficking in a clinical setting. And what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at sort of the 30,000-foot overview of human trafficking. I think Austin summarized a lot of it. We're going to look at a few of the numbers. We're going to look at what human trafficking is and talk about the definitions a little bit. I know I don't have everyone on camera, but I just want to ask real quick. I always start these talks by just asking anyone who is present in person, which today is nobody, or if you're on video, if you have heard of human trafficking prior to this evening's talk, would you just raise your hand for me? And I'll scroll through and look at the videos. Pretty much everybody, and you can do the little raise hand reaction, on the chat, or a thumbs up reaction as well. So that's kind of what I suspected. Pretty much everybody has heard of human trafficking. And if I had asked that question, say 13 years ago, back in 2009, when I was a second-year medical student, which is when I really first learned about modern day slavery and human trafficking and started getting involved with activism work to combat it, really the goal then was just to sort of tell people that human trafficking exists. Taken had just come out and people were sort of like, oh, wow, does that kind of thing really happen? And one of our goals was to kind of teach people, well, yes, it does, but there's not a Liam Neeson type character there to sort of intervene. I mean, this is a real thing that people are facing, and it doesn't happen the same way that it necessarily does in the movies. And I remember us making, t-shirts that we sort of custom printed that said 27 million slaves today. And on the back, it would say, ask me more, because that was the sort of the vital statistic at that point, was that there were, almost 30 million people in slavery in the world. And so we were really just trying to raise awareness. And thankfully, this is an issue that has been talked about more. There are still a lot of taboos around it, but it's something that people know about. And you can look at sort of various moments in our culture. And one of them was recently when some of the conspiracy theorists around COVID-19 started posting pictures on social media, very sensationalized, hypersexualized photos of some child. And I'm going to stop right there because I always forget to do this early in the talk, and I want to do it as soon as possible every time I remember. I wanted to just offer some trigger warnings or some content warnings before we really get into the heart of this talk. Because we're talking about human trafficking, we will be talking about some really, really difficult issues. I've given talks like this, probably a dozen times, and it's still a difficult thing for me to get through. And so if you're hearing it for the first time, we are going to be talking about violence, including emotional and psychological torture and sexual violence towards adults and children. And we're going to be talking about rape, including rape of children and minors. And so this is really difficult content. And so one of the nice things about Zoom is if you are joining us for this session, you're here because you want to learn about human trafficking, you want to advocate for victims and survivors, but feel free to turn off your video, to press mute on your computer or your phone and just walk away for a few minutes and come back. It's being recorded, and I think Time has access to the PowerPoint, and so you can still look at this information later. But if at any point in this talk it's just too much, I completely understand that, and I've been there. So feel free to step away for as long as you need to. Again, talking about the conspiracy theories and the QAnon people who are sort of posting, human trafficking is the real pandemic, and they would post these sensationalized pictures of some child with an adult man sort of hand over their face, or someone who is tied up. And the idea was, why are we talking about some silly virus that's only as deadly as the flu or whatever misinformation is tied to it, when we really should be talking about human trafficking? And while that type of phenomenon is a mixed blessing, certainly lots of money was raised for legitimate human trafficking or anti-human trafficking organizations because of that. ultimately what it was the spread of misinformation. The spread of misinformation or stereotyping of victims and survivors, and sort of glossing over the realities of the life that people face when they're stuck in human trafficking or sex trafficking, only helps the exploiters. It doesn't really help the people being exploited. And so one of the points of today's talk is to provide good information, to provide information about what life is really like for people who are experiencing human trafficking, who are survivors of human trafficking. This is my information here. Let's see if I can advance my slides. So I went to University of Colorado School of Medicine in Denver. I did my residency at Waco Family Medicine residency in Waco, Texas. And for 5 years after residency, worked in the clinic and hospital and emergency room settings. And now over the last month, I've been faculty at University of Illinois in Chicago College of Medicine, specifically at our Rockford campus. And that's my email address, which I can share again at the end of the talk if anyone wants to write that down. The learning objectives today, we're going to understand the different types of human trafficking. We're going to take a look at sort of the statewide, specifically for Texas, I'm sorry, and the international prevalence. We're going to recognize indicators and red flags that you might see in a clinical setting. We're going to talk about how do you then deliver care to people who are in these situations in a trauma-informed way, and how do you connect them with additional resources afterwards. We're going to start with a couple of definitions. So human trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjugation to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. That's a lot. And the reason is because it's a legal definition. It comes from the Trafficking and Victims Protection Act, which is a piece of legislation that helps protect survivors of human trafficking in the United States. And it has been passed and sort of re-ratified by every president and every Senate and Congress, regardless of which political party is in charge. So one of the nice things about this issue as an issue to advocate for is it really does bring people across the aisle from all different ends of the political spectrum and all different worldviews. One of the first talks that I had the privilege to do for Time, it was hosted by Time, but it was co-hosted locally at the medical school by a pro-choice organization sort of that worked in conjunction with Planned Parenthood. But a lot of the original content for that talk came from a nonprofit that was a secular nonprofit that started by a church group. And so you have sort of conservative church groups and student-led organizations supporting, women's reproductive rights, kind of coming together to say, we are all against human trafficking, and we really want to help support survivors and victims. And so the nice thing is that there is support in the government to some degree in more states than in others. We're going to look at some of these definitions in more detail, but first we want to talk about a few subsets. Specifically, there's labor trafficking, which is trafficking for the purposes of exploiting labor. And there's also sex trafficking. So sex trafficking is a form of human trafficking in which commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion again, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not obtained 18 years of age. And the reason that's important is because, children or minors cannot consent to sexual intercourse or sexual acts with adults. And so we really push back hard against the term child prostitute. You might hear that, sort of in society, the idea that that's a child prostitute or an underage prostitute or an underage sex worker. And the reality is because there's a legal issue of consent, and the legal issue is tied inseparably to issues of development, issues of power dynamics, and issues of abuse. Children cannot consent to prostitution or to sex work. And so by definition, even if issues of fraud and force and coercion that we'll talk more about are relatively absent from a human trafficking situation, it's still a trafficking situation if the victim or survivor is a minor. The other term for this is what's called CSEC, C-S-E-C, and this stands for Commercial Sexual Abuse of Children. So you may hear CSEC, you may hear sex trafficking, you may hear human trafficking sort of used interchangeably, and you also may hear sort of sexual slavery, which is a form of human trafficking. And we use these interchangeably to some degree, but we try in these trainings to stick to the same language. The other thing I would just point out at this point when we're talking about this issue of minors involved in human trafficking is the fact that there's legitimate legal sex work in various places in the world and various places in the United States. And so every single person you interact with who is involved in sex work is not necessarily a victim of human trafficking. One thing we do have to keep in mind is there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of gray area here. And the average age of entering into the sex trade is 12 to 14 years of age. And so even if you are interacting with somebody who is by choice an adult sex worker, there is still a possibility that that person was at some point traumatized through human trafficking. And so you want to be respectful of that person's choices while at the same time taking a trauma-informed approach to their care. And that can be a really, really challenging thing to balance. And as long as you keep the patient at the center, then I think you can balance that successfully. I want us to look, and by the way, I'll just throw this out here. I do have the chat pulled out up on another screen. It's always awkward on Zoom because I'm balancing a lot of tech, but if you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself, or feel free to throw them in the chat and I'll just glance over periodically as we go forward with this. These are the definitions of the different actions, means, and purpose. And so we're not going to go into a lot of detail with recruitment, harboring, transporting. The main takeaway there is that human trafficking is not just moving someone across state lines. Certainly in places that share the border with Mexico, we do know that there are coyotes who exploit people through sort of human trafficking in the sense of actually moving them across national or across state lines. And human trafficking as a crime is not limited to only that. Human trafficking, especially for forced labor or sexual exploitation, is all of these things, supplying the people, taking advantage of the people. And so you're guilty of the crime of human trafficking if you are a pimp or a John, if you are someone who has transported or someone who has exploited someone along the way as a part of this crime. I want to spend relatively more time talking about force, fraud, and coercion. These are the means of human trafficking. And these definitions might not be clear sort of immediately, but we'll talk through each of them. Force is sort of what we think of as the traditional trappings of chattel slavery. So when we look at the history of chattel slavery in the United States, we may see images of people in actual sort of bondage. They're tied up, they're held down with heavy chains, they may be kept behind cages, or they may actually be sort of guarded by armed guards. And to some degree, that still occurs in the United States with modern forms of slavery and trafficking, the same way that it did throughout much of our history with chattel slavery in America. But it tends to look a little bit different. And of the three, this tends to be the least common form of control that traffickers will use. But it does happen. I had a patient that I took care of not that long ago, and they had been in a situation where basically she had been alone in a new city. And when money began to get tight, she sort of turned to private stripping. And so she would make arrangements with people through text messages or through social media, and would basically arrange to do, bachelor parties and things like that. It wasn't legal in her city, but this was a choice that she had made. She got hired to come and perform a private strip show. And when she arrived at the hotel room, the man who was there held her at gunpoint and raped her multiple times. And this was something that she, literally force was being used in order to exploit her in this situation. And he then led her to a vehicle, and they began to travel to another part of the city. And while she was sitting in the back of the car, he began to make phone calls to other people to arrange sort of an agenda or a schedule for the rest of the evening, where he would take her to different places, and other men would then pay him for the privilege of raping her as well. And at this point, when she realized what was going to happen, she did something that was incredibly brave and courageous, and sort of took on the role of the action hero in her own story. And she opened the door as soon as she saw sort of a crowd of people when they were driving. She opened the door and she leapt from this moving vehicle, sustaining multiple injuries in the process. And the person who was kind of bringing her into this trafficking situation had no choice but to keep driving, because now there are other people around. They're already calling 911. Police and ambulance would be there in a few minutes. And this is something that definitely does happen. It happened to my patient, but it's very rare. And even this was something that I was really sort of shocked and surprised by, that she'd had an experience like this, because typically it's more these other two. It's more fraud or coercion. Fraud is any sort of lying or deceit. And there is a lot of this, and probably this is the most common type of trafficking sort of method internationally. And so this will be things like the promise of work. You may have someone that you bring to another country, promising them that they'll have a better job, and they sort of have to owe you some money up front in order for them to pay for the fees associated with sort of transporting them and, acquiring documentation and things like this. And ultimately, there actually is no job. They're told, I've got a really good job as a waiter, I've got a good job for you as a model or something along those lines. But really what they've done is they've now recruited you into a trafficking situation. And in those situations, traffickers may keep sort of meticulous documentation of their expenses. Now, it may be 100% fabricated, but it's well documented. And what they'll do is they'll basically enter their trafficking victims into a situation similar to sort of the company store. If we think about, pre-unionization and sort of mining towns and that sort of thing, where they might say to someone, hey, because we transported you from this country to this country, this is how much it costs us to do this. And so this is how much you owe us. So you can't start your new job until you've recouped these expenses. And to do that, you're going to have to do sex work for us. You're going to have to go into prostitution. But because we have to protect our investment, you can't leave. You can't go get your own place to live. You can't walk away from this until we have our money. And then what they'll do is they'll keep, large numbers of people that they're abusing in this way in sort of contained spaces. And they'll sort of upcharge them for basic supplies that they need to survive. They'll say, hey, this is how much money you owed us when we first brought you to this country. But since then, you've bought this many bags of rice, this many bars of soap, and that bag of rice was $5 and that bar of soap was $10. So now the amount that you owed us originally has actually sort of snowballed and you owe us a lot more. You're going to have to work a lot harder and for a lot longer. And ultimately, it's all a scam. There's no way out. But in some countries that don't have the same protection laws the United States have, or where there's locally not good rule of law, a local magistrate or an official, they may see those records. If this person complains that they're in a trafficking situation, that they're being exploited, and they may look and say, well, this isn't slavery, this isn't human trafficking. You owe this person all this money. You have to work for them until it's paid off. And so there are, organizations like International Justice Mission that are working very hard all over the world to get good laws on the books and to get good, honest sort of judges and police officers to recognize that this is not a legitimate form of debt. This is human trafficking. And that happens in the United States as well. But I would say that, fraud and then coercion are probably the two most common kinds in the United States. And coercion is basically everything else. Coercion is real and perceived forms of threat. It's sort of a perceived inability to escape the situation or to leave the situation. It's trauma bonding, it's boyfriending, where you sort of intentionally manipulate someone through sort of this romantic relationship that you develop with them in order to control them. And it's also social isolation. There's so much stigma and shame associated with sex work and with human trafficking that, we've seen documentaries of young girls who want to return home. And as soon as they do, they're treated like they're the scum of the earth because their parents go, oh, well, you've been out there being a hoe. Why don't you just go back to that? You're not my daughter anymore, and things like this. And so that shame can be a really, really powerful way to control people as well. And then there's also common fronts for human trafficking. And so we can talk about a few of these briefly. I lived in Waco for 8 years, and we have a really, really good sort of Heart of Texas human trafficking task force where nonprofits like Unbound and then, local, law enforcement work together to identify potential human trafficking situations. And I cannot tell you the number of illicit massage parlors they've shut down over the years where a report has been made and then they've followed up on it and then provided services to survivors afterwards if they wanted them. Not every massage parlor is a front for human trafficking. You can go out and get a massage legitimately, but it is a common one. Modeling agencies, escort services, and strip clubs, especially strip clubs, are really common because they're sort of a one-stop shop. You can use them to recruit people into the life. You give someone a job as a stripper, and as soon as they start to make a little bit of money, you cut their hours now that they have a car payment, or maybe they've moved into a better place and they have a higher rent. And then you can say, oh, I'm sorry, you're struggling for money. I just don't need you to dance this week, but I've got other work that you can do in order to sort of make a little bit more money and support the lifestyle that you're now committed to. And it's also in the world is Pornhub.com. And this is a website where you can go and look at images and watch videos of pornography. And they got in a lot of trouble a couple of years ago because basically all these accusations started to come out. Anyone in the world could upload pornographic content or pornographic videos to the website. And there is a filtering process to make sure that there is no exploitation or rape. But it was a filtering process in name only. It wasn't really doing its job. And so there are all these stories that came out and women who began to pursue legal action because the video of their rape or their sexual abuse had been posted to this website for the sexual gratification of thousands of strangers. And one of the big problems with that, besides the obvious, is that there was no recourse for them. You know, these women took legal action, they sent emails, they made phone calls to this company, and the company would not take down these videos. And so they just sort of had to live every day with the knowledge that there may be strangers watching a video of them being raped right now. And so eventually legal action sort of progressed to the point that the federal government got involved, and they ended up getting in really, really big trouble. And basically they weren't shut down, but they did have to change their policies to where only sort of trusted pornographic content publishers could then post, basically partners could post content onto their website. And that lasted for a little while. And then it came out that some of their content creators and publishing companies were basically doing the same thing. They were posting content that had been taken from human trafficking or rape or sexual violence situations. And so now they face even stiffer consequences. And none of the major credit card companies are willing to do business with Pornhub anymore. If you want to have like a subscription, you have to buy it with cryptocurrency and things like that. And there are equivalents to this. When you look at things like Backpage.com, Backpage.com was shut down a number of years ago, actually, when I was still in medical school. And this was a website where you could go to basically arrange human trafficking encounters. And so that was shut down, but it still happens every single day on things like Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace. And so because this is an illegal underground operation, it's actually really, really hard to make headway in terms of shutting this down on a systemic level. Human trafficking happens everywhere. As Austin pointed out, it is the third biggest illegal enterprise, just behind drugs and illegal arms trafficking. We estimate that there are 40.3 million slaves worldwide today. Walk Free Foundation in 2016 in its Global Slavery Index estimated this is actually closer to 46 million. And of those 313,000 human trafficking victims in the state of Texas, I don't have data specifically on the state of Arizona, and I apologize. One reason we have this for Texas is because UT did a really, really big study in 2016, really using some excellent and painstaking methodology to try to figure out what the actual numbers were. And there's still a lot of evidence they've underestimated this pretty drastically. Of those 313,000 slaves in Texas, 234,000 are labor trafficking victims. And then 80,000 of them are minors and youth. And here's another way to sort of visualize that data, which I won't stay on for very long, just because this isn't the state that most of you live in. But hopefully we can find some data like this for Arizona, for Illinois, and for the other places that we're going to be doing this training. I just want to say here that it's kind of divided up really nicely in terms of labor trafficking versus sex trafficking, but the reality is there's a lot of overlap. And so people who are exploited in labor trafficking often experience sexual violence, and people who are stuck in sex trafficking are facing a lot of the same life, barriers to their thriving and a lot of the abuses that labor trafficking victims experience every day. And so this is sort of not two separate types of crimes. There's a lot of overlap there. So I guess the question is, why does it matter? I did human trafficking training a few years ago with the FBI, just happened to meet the right person who invited me to come and sit in on this. And it really seemed like, wow, all of these people in the right field to really do something about human trafficking. I'm just a medical student, what am I going to do about it? And the reality is that about 90% of sex trafficking survivors do see a healthcare professional at some point during their trafficking situation, and most of them are not identified. And so this is an area where one of the reasons I love training medical students on this is because there are a few areas as a medical student where you can really be the leader of your healthcare team, whether you're a first year and you're sort of still semi-shadowing, or whether you're a third year and you're on the clerkships, or you're a fourth year and soon to be intern. There are ways that you can lead. One of them is you can be the best person at washing your hands and your stethoscope, because goodness knows that, our residents and our attendings don't do that as well as they used to, and you guys can sort of demonstrate that for them. You can also be the person who remembers to continuously center the patient in their care, and you can be the person who sits by the bedside when there's sort of, grand rounds around the patient and everyone's sort of talking over them. And you can be the person that kneels down next to your patient and explains the acronyms or advocates for them to be brought in as the center of their care, instead of people sort of speaking over their heads. And one way that you can be a leader in your team is by knowing how to recognize and intervene in a human trafficking situation, because it's training that a lot of your attendings and upper level residents may not have had, because it's such an emerging field, especially in the way that it relates to modern medicine. So we're going to look at a few of the risk factors, and we're going to talk through how you might conduct a visit with someone you suspect of being a human trafficking survivor. And I apologize. What time are we going to today? Because I know these are normally an hour, but I thought we had a little bit more time today since we started late.
Yeah, I think if we could wrap up closest to 6, just to respect everybody's time. But I think everyone, if you want to keep going, people can kind of leave at their own accord.
Okay, great. So I will try to go a little bit faster then. So these are some of the top risk factors for human trafficking: immigration status, recruitment debt, low levels of formal education, people who are living in a country that they're not from. And then for sex trafficking, it's homelessness, history of abuse or exploitation, substance use. And when we look at minors specifically, those who are at risk of victimization through CSEC, it's homelessness, it's LGBTQ status. It doesn't mention it here, but also minority, ethnic, or racial status, poverty, family dysfunction. So if you look at this list, these are social determinants of health. And so one of the things when students sort of ask, what can I do to help fight human trafficking? In addition to trainings like this, and specifically looking at this one issue, it doesn't happen in isolation. And so continuing to advocate for systems that take good care of people, regardless of their socioeconomic status, that kind of reinforce efforts towards race equity and health equity, and advocating against sort of systemic discrimination and systemic oppression. Those are some of the things that we can do to fight against human trafficking on a much more foundational level than just sort of identifying victims and helping them get the care that they need. What's life like for a victim of sex trafficking? It's incredibly poor working conditions. Obviously, human trafficking victims are not a monolith. Their experiences are not monolithic. But in general, we can say that often they experience dehydration, poor nutrition, long working hours, overexposure, and especially in labor trafficking, exhaustion and pain associated with that. The realities of the life as a sex trafficking victim: victims are considered commodities by their trafficker no less now than they were during chattel slavery. And buyers and pimps can be violent. I told you that I did training with the FBI. One of the things that we did when we went around the room was to sort of read off during a small group activity, to sort of read off these excerpts from police reports about the violence that human trafficking victims experience. And I'm not going to ask you to go through and read some of these, but I am going to read a few of them for you. So Alex is 11 when her pimp whips her entire back with a belt buckle. The beating leaves permanent scars. Stacy is 14 when a pimp kidnaps her at gunpoint and ties her up for several days. Annabelle is 14 when a John stabs her repeatedly and she needs more than 100 stitches. Janelle is 16 when she is held down at gunpoint, the weapon aimed between her legs, while her pimp carves his name into her thigh. Terry is 13 when she is arrested and raped by a police officer while she's being arrested for the crime of prostitution as a 13-year-old. Carrie is 17 when she witnesses her pimp murdering another girl and she's too scared to tell the police about the crime. There's other stories on here about teenage girls who tried to leave their pimp, and so the pimp put out a hit on them and paid for the hitman with the money that was made through basically their sex trafficking. And so this can be an incredibly violent experience. And while you have people on the other end of that spectrum, you have young women and young men who sort of they've chosen to after school engage in sex work even as a minor, and that's what they consider their after school job, and it's a choice that they make. They're still victims of human trafficking, but it's obviously a very different experience than people who are sort of stuck in the life. There's also a lack of preventative health care. And so you have things like really unsanitary fixes in order to kind of increase productivity. And so I don't know if you guys as medical students have ever actually seen a case of toxic shock syndrome. I've seen one. It's incredibly rare, mainly because the materials that they make tampons and especially super absorbent tampons with are much better and much less able hosts for bacteria than they used to be back in the 80s. And so, toxic shock syndrome is incredibly uncommon. But when you're trapped in a sex trafficking situation, it's not uncommon for a pimp to sort of make someone keep tampons in or multiple tampons in for several days while they're on their period, or even to stuff the vagina with cotton until it seems like the girl is no longer bleeding, because most Johns do not want to rape a teenage girl who's on her period. They want to rape a teenage girl who's not on her period. And so they'll use these unsanitary fixes. And victims of human trafficking are at risk of toxic shock syndrome, in addition to pelvic inflammatory disease and other sexually transmitted infections like HIV. And then oftentimes it's treated inadequately because they don't have good access to follow-up care. So one of the questions we always hear, sort of in the community from people who are learning about human trafficking for the first time is, well, why don't they just leave? I mean, this sounds horrible. So why do they stay in that situation? And I think you all know as medical students, this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I think all of you are probably well versed and have had classes in domestic violence and domestic abuse. And it's not really a trauma-informed question to ask, why don't you leave that situation? Because there are often compelling reasons: shame or guilt, lack of transportation, having your movement controlled. International trafficking, often traffickers will take the ID or the passport of the person who's being trafficked, and they'll sort of tell them that if you go to the police, you'll be put in prison, because they may not know how the legal system works in the country that they've been brought to, or that may be a valid threat, and they may be at risk of being arrested for prostitution and put in prison if they try to leave their trafficking situation. Fear of report to social services. Many trafficking victims have children, and so they're worried that their children will be taken away because this is still seen as a crime, or being seen as sort of an unfit parent if you've been involved and victimized through these situations. And there's also real and perceived fear of retaliation. I have a patient that I've taken care of for many years, and after a while, she started to open up to me about the human trafficking situation she had been involved in as a child. And as a child and adolescent, she had been trafficked by a relative who would, pick her up after school and take her out to see a few Johns, and he would keep all the money. And she was forced to perform sexual acts with them. And this was something that, she as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old, 11-year-old knew was illegal. She knew it was wrong. It was obviously not something that she had any consent to being a part of this process. But the reason that she didn't tell anyone or make an outcry, in addition to the shame that she felt, was because she had a younger sister. And so this relative would say to her, oh, you want to leave? You want to stop? You don't want to do this anymore? That's okay. You don't have to. But your little sister is looking really grown up these days. And I bet she would enjoy it if you didn't want to do it. And I'll bring her out with me instead of you. And so this is the way that he kept her in the life for many, many years. And it was sort of her way of protecting those around her. And that wasn't an empty threat. And there's also things like Stockholm syndrome or trauma bonding, where sometimes those relationships, when you've been through so much shared trauma together, actually become really, really important in a really kind of pathological way to the person who is experiencing this abuse and this exploitation. And so there's really complex reasons why people don't just get up and walk away from these situations because of that forced fraud and coercion. And I think it's really important that we understand that we understand the mindset of the victim, that we understand the experience that they've had. And these can be really, really challenging, difficult patients. These may not be somebody, if you have some sort of, medical fantasy, if someone says, help, I'm a victim of human trafficking, and you can say, that's okay, I know what to do. That's probably not how things are going to play out. I mean, these can be really difficult patients. This may be the patient that comes to see you in clinic who is always really, really rude and verbally abusive to your staff, and they're just sort of rough around the edges. Or it may be that patient that always comes in and you can never really get them to open up towards you, and something's going on, but you just don't know what, because they won't give you any history, and you kind of wonder to yourself, Why are they even there? And so it can be really, really challenging to take care of these patients. I think it's especially challenging if you're male. And I think if you are a female presenting person, there's so much male privilege in medicine still. There's so much sort of misogyny still in medicine today, and especially medical education, that I think this is one of those very rare examples of definite sort of female privilege. I think it may be easier in a lot of cases to sort of form a therapeutic relationship with a victim of human trafficking, because most people who are pimps or johns, most people who exploit others through human trafficking are male. And so if you are a male doctor and you're taking care of someone who's experienced that, you may be the first male presenting person they've interacted with in weeks or months who didn't actually sexually assault them. And so that can be a huge hurdle to sort of overcome in terms of trying to build a trusting relationship with them. So I want to go from here and talk about what indications should sort of raise suspicion. We've talked about some of them already: homelessness, questionable employment, abusive relationships, substance abuse, refusing to answer questions. And we can talk about this concept of sort of looking to someone else to answer the questions for you. That is not necessarily always an indication of abuse, but it's one of the things that should raise sort of our red flags. And I know people who will go into medical visits and they have been so traumatized or humiliated through their interactions with doctors that they bring somebody as an ally to answer questions for them. And sometimes they bring somebody who may be in a role where they're more likely to believe. They bring their friend who's a nurse, or they bring their friend who's a higher socioeconomic status to sort of answer for them because they want them to be heard. But we also know, just like with child abuse and domestic violence, with human trafficking, that there are often controllers who will actually enter the medical realm with that person who's being victimized. They may fill out the paperwork, they may answer all the questions. And it's sort of hazardous because this person, because they're not experiencing sort of daily trauma and abuse, they may be somebody who it's easier to talk with. They may be fairly suave and fairly sophisticated in their answers. And so if you have someone come in and they are on drugs, or they're not answering your questions, and they bring somebody who seems eager to help and answer your questions that you have, it may be really easy to sort of accidentally ally yourself with that person. And now you're talking to a trafficker and you're telling them, hey, you're going to make sure that she takes all of her medicines, right? Or, hey, you're going to make sure she makes it to her follow-up appointment, right? You're going to do that for me. And you have to recognize that this is often the dynamic, is that this is actually someone who's controlling that other person. Oftentimes this doesn't happen because there are now, cell phones, and there's other ways of sort of controlling someone, even if you're not in the room with them, and sending text messages to sort of check in, or weaving false narratives that say, hey, I'm going to bring you to this doctor's office, but I have access to your medical records, so don't tell them anything about what's going on here. And so just because a trafficker isn't present doesn't mean that that's not a human trafficking situation. And then I want us to just spend a little bit of time, I know we're close on time, looking at sort of the general health conditions that people might face. There was a restaurant that was shut down a few years ago in Waco because basically one of our faculty at the residency program had been through some human trafficking training, and they had a patient who had come to see them a few times with very vague complaints, tension headaches, shoulder and neck pain, fatigue, feeling exhausted all the time. And because they knew the questions to ask, they eventually, over the course of several visits, were able to determine that basically the reason this person was always tired was because they were sleeping on the floor inside the restaurant where they worked, and they were made to work from early in the morning to late at night with no break. And they asked them one of the specific questions we teach you to ask, which is, can you leave your job if you want to? And the answer was no. And so they made a report to the Human Trafficking Task Force, which then conducted a raid with the support of social services and nonprofits, and was able to shut down that restaurant, arrest the people who were trafficking the workers there, and then offer aftercare to the survivors. And so sometimes these are very vague, chronic symptoms that you really have to sort of dive into the social situation around them. There are other more severe forms of this: really bad malnutrition, untreated chronic illnesses. And then there are things that may be a little bit more specific to human trafficking, things like recurrent multiple sexually transmitted infections. I have patients who I treat for chlamydia or gonorrhea maybe 5 times a year. And I've asked all the questions to try to figure out, is this something that is happening through volitional sexual intercourse? And I think that what's at the heart of that story is relationships with really, really untrustworthy men. But it should be a red flag when you have someone who seems to be having recurrent, sexually transmitted infections, and sort of, you've talked with them and counseled them about how to prevent that, but it continues to happen. And people with more advanced, sexually transmitted infections, things like pelvic inflammatory disease. Obviously, we see tons of people presenting late for care in pregnancy, but we always want to understand the social situation that's sort of underlying their ability to get care earlier. Oftentimes, it's just sort of our broken medical system, but we need to be aware of the other things that can cause that. And then, of course, vaginal or rectal trauma can be a big indicator on your physical exam as well. You may see these patients as aggressive. There may be anxiety, definitely PTSD and trauma responses. And so you have to be aware of those, and that's going to complicate your diagnosis, but it should also be a red flag if some of these other things start to add up and you see that this patient is really struggling from a mental health standpoint, then it may be sort of an early hint even before you've developed that trusting relationship and they've divulged their history to you. It may be sort of an early indicator of the types of things that they've been through. Addiction is another big one. One of the other areas that I teach in is medication-assisted therapy and with Suboxone or buprenorphine. And drugs are often used sort of as a carrot and a stick by traffickers. And so if you want someone to stay up all night long because you have scheduled for them to, be raped by 10 to 15 to 20, Johns that night, you may need to give them some cocaine or some amphetamines or some speedball or something to sort of keep them awake and seemingly engaged in those activities during the course of the evening. And then when they come back, they've had all these traumatic experiences, and you may use opioids or heroin, benzodiazepines, or alcohol in order to calm them and calm some of those trauma responses. And so addiction or substance use dependence is also a big one. And then you want to keep in mind your differential diagnosis. Obviously, none of these things are pathognomonic to trafficking. And so you have to keep in mind domestic violence, rape or serial rape, child abuse, and homelessness, and other forms of victimization. I want to move on to some questions that we can ask real quick. Very briefly, we'll talk about what do victims and survivors need to know. And what they really need to know is I think, just a few things. Number one, there is a way out. They need to be connected with resources that if it's an adult, they do not have to make the decision to leave their human trafficking situation today. There is no legal obligation for them to leave. A crime is being committed, but they are the victim of that crime. And so all the normal sort of guidelines that you would use in a domestic abuse situation are there. If they decide not to leave, your job is to help them sort of make it to the next step on the stages of change model. If they are pre-contemplative, how do you get them to contemplative? If they're contemplative, how do you help them start planning? So some things that you can do is to provide them with resources like the human trafficking hotline. And you may have to give them that number in a way that's discreet. They may not be able to take a human trafficking hotline business card, but you may be able to program that number in their phone for them if they consent to it under some sort of false name. This is Diane, and Diane is really the human trafficking hotline in their cell phone if they decide they're ready to ask for help. You want to make sure that you are approaching this patient cautiously. Human trafficking is so sensationalized that if this occurs in your emergency department and it sort of gets around, oh, they think the patient in room 4 is a human trafficking victim, all the people in the emergency room may want to come and see that patient. They want to sort of see this sensationalized medical complaint, but you really need to limit the number of people that are involved. I'll get in trouble for telling you this as residents, but this is the patient you break your duty hours for. This is the person who, if there's nobody that they trust in the ER besides you and your shift is over, if it's at all possible, this may be the person that you sort of stick it out and see it through with them, or you help them sort of transition to somebody else that they trust in the emergency department. And you definitely want to preserve their autonomy. You want to make sure that you are respecting their decisions, because they are often coming from a situation where they have no autonomy in any area of their life. They are constantly exploited by the people in their lives. And so you don't want healthcare to be just one more area where their choices and their decisions are taken away from them. If you can re-empower your patient in their healthcare, and it's true for all patients, but it's especially true for people who are victims of human trafficking. And then you want to connect them with resources and counseling. And I think this can be a really, really powerful thing. One of the human trafficking survivors that I told you about, she had been through this horrendous trafficking experience, and And it took her a really, really long time to tell me about that as her doctor, even though we had sort of built rapport and we had sort of built a trusting relationship. And it was because of this shame that she felt because she didn't know about human trafficking. She just thought, I can't believe I fell for this scam and I can't believe this happened to me. Her narrative was, I am the dumbest person that I would allow this to happen. I'm so stupid. And so when she finally sort of told me what her experience was that had led to all these injuries and all this psychological trauma, I was able to connect her with Unbound, who has counseling services available. And it was the most helpful thing in the world to meet with a counselor who knew about human trafficking and could tell her, millions of people have been through something like what you've been through. You are not alone. You're not the only one, and could then help her to start do counseling specifically for her trafficking experience. And so you want to be able to connect victims and survivors with these resources. You also want to make sure that you are sort of ready for unfamiliar narratives. To whatever degree this talk has been sort of shocking to some of you who are hearing it for the first time, that's the way that I have felt hearing these stories specifically directly from victims and survivors. And so you want to be non-judgmental in your approach, even though you're hearing stories that may be really, really uncomfortable and really, really unfamiliar. And then I think this is the biggest takeaway as you sort of think about how will I interact with these patients in the emergency department or in other settings. And it's, you need to be ready, just like when taking a sexual history or a complex medical history, that you start with open-ended questioning, but you have to have in your tool belt these specific direct questions that get to the heart of labor trafficking or sex trafficking. If you have a job, you should be making money for doing your job. And so if someone can't tell you the type of work they do and you say, well, what type of work do you do? And they can't answer. Or if you ask them, can you leave your job if you want to? Are you able to take days off? Are you getting paid for your job? It feels so dumb to ask someone, are you getting paid for your job? Because that's what a job is. And yet there are people who do their job, they consider it their job, but they're not getting paid for it. And that's a big, big red flag for slavery or exploitation through trafficking. Do you have control of your money? Who keeps most of your money? Now that's kind of a loaded question because a lot of us are in jobs where we don't keep most of the money that's made. But if you're keeping almost none of it, and the person immediately above you is taking in all of this money, that could be a trafficking situation as well. And then with sex trafficking, the big questions like, have you ever traded sex for drugs, for money, for other favors, for a place to stay, for a cell phone, things like that? Have you had STIs? How many sexual partners have you had? And it's a real skill to be able to take a sexual history in a non-judgmental way, but it's really, really important when you're trying to get to the heart of a sex trafficking situation. And then there are secondary questions, you can ask someone, have you ever participated in the commercial sex industry? Have you ever done sex work? And even though we push back against the term child prostitute, that may be the cultural understanding of that type of work. And it's not wrong if you have a minor or an adolescent that you suspect is in the life to ask them if they've ever done prostitution work or if they've ever stripped or done other sex work. Because that may be the clue that you need that something's going on with the trafficking situation. I'm going to skip through this really quick because it sort of talks about the same questions that we've already asked, but there are some sort of relatively clinically validated questionnaires that you can use if you suspect a minor who's involved in sex trafficking. So, and this is really more, it's the same types of questions, but this is really more speaking to the phrasing. Some kids have a hard time living at home. Have you ever run away from home? Some kids use drugs or drink alcohol. And so you're normalizing their experience while at the same time trying to understand sort of the atypical things that they've experienced through human trafficking or other types of exploitation. And then the same thing, talking about the number of sexual partners, number of STIs. And again, you have to be really non-judgmental here. Somebody's choices about the number of sexual partners that they have in a year may be different than mine. Their choices about what tattoos they want on their body may be different than mine. But really the question that you need to ask is it their choice at all? Is the number of sexual partners they've had congruent with the amount of sexual partners they desire to have? And if it's not, then why do they have more sexual partners than what they want? Is it because it's being forced on them? And these questions go through sort of the same thing, and asking those really direct questions can be really, really powerful. And I think many of us have experienced this phenomenon where we have someone who we just know, because of the answers they've given us and because of the medical issues they're facing, we know there's an abuse situation. And I've had patients where it wasn't until I said, did your husband hit you? And just let that question hang in the air, that we were finally able to sort of make an outcry and honestly, address that situation, because those direct questions don't leave as much room to sort of lie to yourself that everything's okay. So you can communicate hope. You have rights. You're not alone. You are entitled to services. You want to assess their safety the same way that you would for a victim of child abuse or a victim of domestic violence. Is it safe right now for you to leave? Now, if this is a child or a minor, then you have the responsibility decisions, then really you're helping them do sort of an immediate needs assessment and helping to arrange for follow-up care. If I let you go home today, or if I send you home today from this visit, are you going to hurt yourself or someone else? Or do you expect that you'll be hurt, when you leave this clinic? And is there anybody else involved? There may be other victims that they live with or that they interact with who may be at risk, and they may be willing to make an outcry on behalf of those people, even if for themselves, they're still not sure about that decision, but you have to respect their decisions. If you're in the hospital setting, getting social work involved. If it's a recent experience of sexual assault, then you want to get sort of a SANE team involved to actually do a forensic examination. And then you want to connect them with appropriate services, including, if at all possible, some sort of follow-up care with a physician or a health professional who is well versed in issues of human trafficking, so they can continue to provide reinforcement of this person's rights and their autonomy, and that they have avenues to safely leave their situation. And then what not to do. Do not attempt to rescue your patient. I remember the first time that I did training on this, I wanted to go down to the bus stop in Denver and I wanted to bust skulls. The statistics were that a runaway is approached by a human trafficker within about 48 hours, typically. And that's places like bus stops and taxi stalls and things like that before Uber. And so I wanted to go and just say, hey, I'm going to go rescue some people. And if I felt that way as a third-year medical student, I know that's the way that sort of these FBI agents and those types of people felt. But the reality is that our job is to center the patient, and it's to provide a trauma-informed response where we are trying to reinforce their autonomy. We're trying to reinforce and sort of normalize the feelings that they have of these horrible experiences, and trying to restore some sort of sense of control and autonomy that they have. Don't make promises that you can't keep. If you don't know your local resources, don't promise that there's definitely a bed in a safe house that they have access to that day if you don't actually know. That's when you want to use your local resources and also the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. And whatever you do, do not use force, fraud, or coercion in order to rescue them from a human trafficking situation. Those are the means by which they have been abused and exploited, and healthcare needs to be a place that is 100% safe from those types of dynamics. Here are some additional resources that you can look at. Some of these have additional online trainings, and of course, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center is a great clearinghouse. It's led by Polaris Project, and this is a great place to connect with other resources and other people working in human trafficking as well. I ran through that a little bit more quickly towards the end because I wanted to make sure that we respected everyone's time. Also wanted to allow time for any questions that you might have. So please feel free. I'll look through the chat, but if anyone has any questions, comments, clarifications, please feel free now. Thank you, Austin, for sharing that resource specifically for Arizona.
One other thing that I wanted